Welcome, everybody, to Identity International's first ever webinar series, Kashmir Beyond Conflict. This series will be running throughout the month of October, every Thursday and Saturday at 5 p.m. British Summer Time, where we will delve into the complexities of Kashmiri identity with our esteemed guests. To receive notifications and updates regarding the series, please follow our social media platforms and or register on our Eventbrite page by searching Kashmiri Beyond Conflict. Today, we will be in conversation with Anuradha Bhasin. Anuradha is the executive editor of the Kashmir Times, the oldest English daily newspaper in Jammu and Kashmir, which has continued to maintain an independent voice despite receiving many threats and intimidations. Anuradha is also a peace activist involved in campaigns for justice, for human right violations, victims in Kashmir. She has conducted research on media reportage, conflict, human rights, and gender, and contributes regularly to several newspapers, magazines, periodicals, and anthologies. Anuradha, thank you so much for joining us today. Let's get straight to it. Basically, the first question that I would like to pose to you is, what does it mean to you to be Kashmiri, like for you personally?
This is a very complicated question because I'm not an ethnic Kashmiri. If you look at Kashmir, what does it mean? It means Kashmir is a word that is interchangeably used to mean Jammu and Kashmir as it stood in on August 15, 1947. And it is also used to for the Kashmir region where the ethnic Kashmiris live. So in some ways, yes, our political identity, as we grew up, we were aware that there is a Kashmir connection, that we are Kashmiris in some ways. I come from Jammu region, and the identities have been so complex because the knowledge of dispute didn't come to me, came to me gradually as we were growing up, and it seemed like kind of a dead or kind of almost a dead conflict at some point in my growing up years. Um, so there was always also that mixed identity of being an Indian. Um, but as I grew up, and you learn about the conflict and how, and you start reading about the history and what is unique about Jammu and Kashmir's history, about how New Delhi has tackled Kashmir, or about how Islamabad has also tackled Kashmir, and how there have been mistakes made by both the states, because of which the people of Kashmir have paid a price. And you start kind of, your identity becomes more and more muddled. And what I felt till at least a year ago, I felt very comfortably. I felt that I was South Asian, of course, and I was Kashmiri. And today, that identity is again something that I keep questioning, because what happened last year, as Jammu and Kashmir becomes more and more fragmented, and it's not just slicing up the state and demoting it into two union territories. It's also about how divisive the politics has become. So where do I really stand? And at a time when a lot of Kashmiris that you speak to, they suddenly do not identify themselves with, they've started going back, several centuries back in time, and they're trying to locate their history in with Central Asia rather than with South Asia. And that is something where, as me as a person, what is my ethnicity? I've never had very strong identity feelings, but suddenly I don't feel like nobody at all. And my personal history, if I may talk about that, is that my forefathers came from West Punjab, which is now in Pakistan, more than 100 years ago. And so there is that Punjabi identity, there is a Jammu identity, there is a Kashmiri identity. There was a Bhimper identity, there was a Bhimper connection in between. And all these identities I carry on myself, and I really don't seem to belong anywhere at the moment. I It seems I've been sliced up into small, small pieces. And if sometimes I feel the only thing I can safely today say is I'm a human being, and that also it might sound very cynical. That also sometimes I question when you live so close to a conflict and you see that spreading, not just in your home region. You also see it spreading through the length and breadth of the subcontinent, and the kind of injustices taking place, the kind of violence taking place, how it dehumanizes the soul. And I mean, it's a very distressing experience on on its own.
Yeah, no, I can imagine. It's incredible. I feel like it's borders and nationalism and different political ideologies and different sort of ethnic ideologies. It's become a common problem, I feel like, amongst minority groups within major nation states, at least, trying to define where they're supposed to place themselves within, all of the issues that are surrounding them, especially with conflict areas like
Yeah,
Kashmir as
also,
well.
also I feel identity is something very restrictive. You can belong to a certain community, you can belong to a certain region, and you can still have very different views from what the majority
Yeah.
opinion of your community, of your region is. And as it is, I'm not religious, I'm pretty much an atheist. So, which is why also perhaps, I keep questioning, I see my identity very differently.
No, it's very interesting. That was yeah, that's that I and then where do you place yourself amongst the sides that emerged during this conflict? You know,
I place myself on the side of truth and justice, and that I can say with confidence. It's something I strongly believe in, and something that I will continue to do as long as I can.
are there any particular sort of, you know, aspects of Kashmiri culture in specific that you might identify with or you might relate to, or it's just anything like, sort of from memories of growing up in the region?
We as since I was a child, we shuttled between the two cities. Mostly lived in Jammu, but even when I started working, I shuttled between the two cities. Where I lived in Jammu, that was a Muslim majority area. In the winters, the flats we used to stay in were meant for the move employees. So they were packed with a lot of Kashmiris. So I had the best of both cultures, and an influence of both the cultures. And I think at that time, I think growing up in the 70s and 80s was, I think, the best part in best time in Jammu and Kashmir, which was kind of laid back. There wasn't much conflict going on. There were, um, a lot of shared spaces, secular spaces, and I think I got the best of both. There was kind of, in a way, very laid back lifestyle even in Jammu at that time, and I particularly I was extremely and continue to be extremely impressed by the warmth of ethnic Kashmiris, and it is quite exceptional, and something that continues to exist despite such a distressing situation. It's been impacted, and it's, I won't say diluted, but it's been dented, but it continues to be there.
It
And it's just
resists.
amazing. I mean, you're going through a problem, the entire neighborhood will stand up for you. And I face that
Yeah,
kind of situation,
this
so it's,
solidarity.
yeah, the
It's
solidarity
very
is it,
evident.
it,
Yeah,
it is
and
exceptional. It is.
it's very evident. You can see that amongst like
Yeah.
all the activists and especially on their social media, is just the solidarity that exists within the Kashmiris and how the
Yeah.
resistance that
Yeah,
exists.
even for strangers, I remember. Well, I won't don't look like a Kashmiri. I don't even look like a Jammuite from what I look like, and I look mostly like a tourist in Kashmir, and people look at me, I kind of stand out. So there was this, I think probably 2010, and that summer agitation going on and prolonged bunds and everything. And so we, in the evening, we were just taking a stroll, and my husband and we were walking down the bund, and there was a small shop, beyond Abiguzar, in the Abiguzar area, just near the bund, and there's this lady sitting there and selling chickens, and so I just asked what the price of the chickens was, and she looks up to me and she's saying in Kashmiri, she's so sympathetic to me, poor tourists, they caught up in this. So I didn't disappoint her, I didn't clarify, so, but that was something very sweet.
Yeah, no. It's little things like that that I think have the
Yeah.
biggest impact,
It's very touching. It is very touching.
Yeah, they do. That's very
Mhm.
no, it's heartwarming. So that sort of another type of, and this is obviously a bit more complicated, but it's just asking us to like obviously the conflict itself. Now it gets in the limelight. The conflict gets, you either have the Indian side or you have the Pakistani side. You don't really get the sort of Kashmiri side as to like what the conflict, what do Kashmiris really want out of settlements and things. And I think within Kashmiris themselves there's obviously disagreements, and naturally so, because the over time the conflict itself has gotten more and more complicated. Before it might have been Kashmiris versus the rest, but now I think there's a lot of sort of maybe even more civil differences, if I could say that. How do you think that has impacted how you feel like as well within, like, whilst you're sort of navigating in Kashmir, as in within like Kashmiri spaces over time?
I think I feel the need for what we've been talking about for years, many people like me, that there is a need for dialogue. There is a need for dialogue between Islamabad and New Delhi. There is a need for involving the people of Jammu and Kashmir at the dialogue table. There is a need for an intrastate dialogue, because the aspirations of different regions, their ideologies, their thinking is very, very different. What are their different concerns? Let them talk. Let them have an intra Kashmir dialogue. And when we say Kashmiris should have a space at the dialogue table, it means people from all the regions of Kashmir. Having said that, we've been also saying that since Kashmir Valley has been more affected and has faced the major brunt of the conflict because of the violence, because of the scale of human rights violations, because of the psychological trauma that exists there. A beginning needs to be made from there, because those are the people who lost confidence in India, on Pakistan, on any kind of a peace process. I mean, peace processes did start in 2000, and people had expectations at that time. People wanted to be involved, but they were left out. And finally, the peace process just fizzled out, unfortunately. But I think there is a need to recontinue from where we left in 2006 or 7.
What do you think are the biggest hindrances to that, the peace process
The
sort of?
the biggest hindrances are the mutual, one is the hawks on both sides, of course, who have a vested interest in perpetuating the conflict. There are mutual misunderstandings and insecurities which need to be addressed, and it's difficult to address them. It's difficult because it's been 7 decades, and for 7 decades it's been a festering sore, and not just Kashmir, all the other
Yeah.
bilateral issues. I mean, Kashmir is very central, of course.
Yeah.
And I feel somewhere we need to relook, um, go back into a partition, or maybe even before that, when that whole two nation theory came up, why it came up, and why was there a need for a separate nation for Muslims? What is it that went wrong? We need to look into these questions. We need to look at how the subcontinent was turned into a battleground for mutilation and massacres and massive destruction. I mean, the biggest ever bloodshed that the world has ever seen. And somehow the two nations were so in so much of a tearing hurry. The leaders on both sides, they may have been visionaries, but they were in such a tearing hurry to move on. I think it was a big mistake not to address that question, not to reopen those wounds, and those wounds have continued to haunt us on both the sides, and that is something that needs to be reopened. I mean, there was never any closure, and
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I mean, we can
there
see the
never was
repercussions
any
of
closure.
that.
I
Yeah,
truly have.
we can definitely see the repercussions of that. I mean, the conflict itself speaks for that. It's
So
would
it is a
you
very difficult situation. I mean, even talking about, okay, let's talk about, trusting each other. Let's talk about resolving our issues. And as long as the root remains, um, the root cause of mistrust, I don't see we can make a very effective, peacemaking there.
um, now on a more, I mean, back to sort of being on a more personal level, being a woman and then having such a successful career, how has that within like Kashmiri society, has that hindered you ever? Like, has that ever come across as, I mean, because you hear that a lot about in, I mean, South Asia as well, is how difficult it can be sometimes to be a woman. Have you faced
Yeah.
the
I have, but I must admit, I come from a privileged class, and that has so being a woman in some ways. I mean, being a privileged class, my father was a well-known person. He was a well-respected person, both in across Kashmir, and that sometimes has been made people accept me. At sometimes it has also raised the expectations of the people, so it's acted both ways. But I must admit, unlike I'm sensitive, I'm aware of what women go through, especially those who have to start from scratch, those who've had no backing. um, so and making it on their own. I do acknowledge the kind of problems they go through. I've had my share of problems, but I think compared to many others, they have been much less.
someone else has asked, is has your upbringing as as a Kashmiri defined your career path and your activism?
Yeah, in some ways. I mean, I grew up, and the only profession I saw was, it was either politics, because my father was in politics also earlier. So he was a journalist, he was bringing out a newspaper. I was fond of writing, I was fond of reading. And of course, as a teenager, I used to write short stories and poetry, and I wanted to be a writer. And but having been acquainted to um, the field of journalism, I kind of, in my early years, I kind of mistook both creative writing and journalism, and I thought I could do both. And ultimately, I don't think I've just done justice to any. But so I just joined as a reporter, and which interestingly in 1989, which is I just passed out of college. I was planning to study also side by side, and then I got so sucked in by the profession, and because at the time that was a crucial time. Being in Jammu, which was impacted at that in the 80s by the Punjab militancy, and in 89 Kashmir militancy was just starting, and there was need to go back into history as well. There was so much to follow, there was so much to learn, there was so much to understand that I was completely sucked in. I think that is somewhere I forgot everything about writing stories and writing poetry, and I got into unraveling what is happening, unraveling the past, trying to understand uh, why things are happening the way they are, and where are they taking us. Um, so that yeah,
No,
was.
thank, yeah, no, that was a helpful answer. Another question that we've had is, do you think all peripheral minority groups, such as the Kashmiris, should have their own state within the current system? If yes, how far can we stretch this to accommodate all the groups advocating for their own separate states? If not, what are the alternatives?
Right now, it's very difficult to even. I mean, I agree with that. They should have their. They should be the main stakeholders. They are the main stakeholders. They're not the third party. They are the first party. Um, but to carve out a space for them today is even more difficult. Look at the whole politics of control, which has been there ever since 1947, maybe even before that, if you will, back
Do you,
a little more. But today I don't have answers. I really don't have answers. But I think somewhere a beginning has to be. One needs to, particularly what is happening on the Indian side in Kashmir, is very much linked to what is happening in rest of India as well. So somewhere we need to link it to that. What is happening in Pakistan? I mean, in the Pakistani side of Kashmir as well, is also because of the lack of a stable democracy in Pakistan for 70 years. The different power centers that have emerged in the last 70 years in Pakistan, and how that whole politics of control keeps going on, and how Kashmir becomes a scapegoat, or just a tool in the hands of both sides. Mm, it is. I really don't have answers, but somewhere I think the beginning would have to be made. Maybe at least begin from 2002. Go back to 2002. Start talking. Um, Sounds easy, because if you look at the powers that are particularly on the Indian side, you don't see that happening. And which is why it is very important to link it to what is happening in India today. And in fact, you see the entire Indian landscape um, becoming more and more Kashmir like.
do you think over the 70 years, the borders have sort of led to the evolution of a difference between the two sides in Azad Kashmir and on the Indian side, or would you think that the conflict allows them to have that solidarity still and sort of maintain a common Kashmiri identity?
It's very interesting, because if you keep them away and you keep perpetuating an ultra nationalistic, jingoistic narrative, the people get carried away by that. But at the time when that peace process was starting, the roads started opening. There were delegations coming and going. People to people interaction was increased, and that is something good. I mean, that is one positive that happened even in Kashmir that we should not ignore. People from this side and that side were coming and meeting each other. There were delegations also. I went several times. Um, and the kind of euphoria you found on each side, the kind of nostalgia that it was rekindling in the second and the third generation, because the stories had been passed on. So there was a lot of warmth, and there was a lot of brotherhood, and if people were talking about unification and people were talking about softer borders, so you give them that chance, that will happen. But when you're looking at borders, I think today we also need to remind ourselves it's not just India, Pakistan. We see China coming up from the north, and that is something that is extremely worrying. Um, I hadn't read about this, but yesterday somebody I was speaking to reminded me that Mahatma Gandhi had warned in 1947. He had said that both sides on Kashmir, he said that it was at 47 or 48 before, just before he was assassinated, that both sides have made mistakes on Kashmir, and they need to resolve uh, Kashmir, and the need is urgent, because if they don't understand it, a third party might come in and take away Kashmir. And that warning, I mean, 70 years later, is appearing quite true.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. That was very interesting. I mean, if you have any other, oh, sorry, I mean, another question has come up, is with your experience on the Kashmir Times, to what extent do you feel that you have to censor your content?
Um, Look, I won't censor my content, but the kind of intimidations and threats that the media is witnessing right now, we become careful with the kind of words that we use. And every time you think of, you have to keep reading and rereading. The problem that has happened is something different in our case. um, there's a different way in which the government ensures censorship of people who are unwilling to, be tamed. And what they do is you choke their financial revenue, and that completely disallows you from working in many ways. I mean, today we've had to suspend our Srinagar edition. We had to do that. Even the Jammu edition was suspended. We were only going online, and we've managed the Jammu edition. We hope to restart the Srinagar edition. The problem is when you don't have finances, your circulation is going to be impacted, which is
Yeah.
one problem. You will not have enough staff on roll. So that censorship in some form does come up. You'll miss one story or two story. You will not have enough details. The kind of investigation that you really want to do, the kind of things that you want to unravel, the truth that you want to know, you really don't have that full picture. Um, so it's a censorship by default. It's not something deliberate, and we are trying our best to you know see how we can rectify the problem,
Yeah.
overcome the problem, find a different revenue model. Um, Amidst COVID, that's even more difficult.
Of course. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's understandable. But yeah. Are there any other closing remarks that you would like to make? Anything that you would like to personally say around Kashmiri identity by any chance?
Um, I think, if you're a Kashmiri, particularly if you're an ethnic Kashmiri, today it's something that uh, is so easy to target you, particularly in India. I mean, just being a Kashmiri itself is enough to pronounce you a terrorist and anti-national, or whatever. Because if you look at what is happening in India, I mean, anybody dissenting today can be slapped with anti-terror laws, can be booked for Official Secrets Act, can be maligned, can be even, that whole drug um, charges or narcotics, and anything can be used against you. So when you're a Kashmiri, and particularly if you're a Muslim, I think that it becomes just so easy. So it's very difficult being a Kashmiri today. Um, I think that's
No, That's a touching remark, and it makes you understand very well as to how the impact on the conflict has had, the conflict has had on sort of the Kashmiris themselves. And I know all of this, it comes up a lot of the time. I mean, in activism and humanitarian causes, but I still do feel like that personal kind of struggle that Kashmiris feel, that doesn't get enough of a platform, especially on the limelight, like the
Yeah,
actual stories that you hear.
right.
They're
One thing, if I have a minute, I'd
Yeah,
like
of
to add
course,
one
yes.
more thing that, I can understand that whole the psychological stress and trauma that Kashmiris are going through, particularly the ethnic Kashmiris, or even people in Rajouri, Poonch, Doda, Bhadarwar. I mean, today there is anger in the youth, even in Jammu, in Ladakh. But in the Kashmir Valley, it's of a different nature. And they feel so let down, they feel disappointed, they feel angry, and they feel humiliated. Um, and that anger sometimes can be very, very dangerous. And I feel that we should have faith in um, in knowledge, in truth seeking. In It's difficult to do that, and in a non-violent path. The more violently aggressive we get, we may be playing into the hands of the people who are perpetuating the problem.
I think
That's
that's a very
it's not an easy thing to do, but that's something big because of what I see, where I see the youth going. It's a very worrying sign. That's a natural fallout of what is happening in Kashmir. But I think the younger people particularly should read. There is, Kashmiris are very talented. They are politically very conscious and very educated, and I think that's the direction they should be moving in. Use their knowledge, read, and articulate as much as you can, and that is what embarrasses and unnerves a perpetrator more than a gun.
I think that's a very wise note to end on. No, thank you for that.
Thank you.
Very good advice on that part. Thank you so much for
Thank
joining us
you.
today. We greatly appreciate it. It was a very insightful conversation. I hope you enjoyed it yourself as well.
Of course.
Um,
Thank you, Ms. Pierre.
and I would like to thank our audience for watching. Our next episode will be on the following Saturday at the same time at 5 o'clock British Standard Time. We will be in conversation with another prominent journalist from Kashmir, Haziq Qadri, and I hope you can all join us for that too. Thank you again from
Thank you.
Identity International. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.